Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. I want to talk for a few minutes about a range of issues which have the potential to be quite significant in the way that we live our lives as Christians, and which indeed have the potential to be somewhat divisive, but which are not really doctrinal in character. They're more to do with the individual quirks, I guess, of the way that different families shape their Christian lives. The way that we make decisions about especially how to engage with various aspects of the culture around us. I have in mind questions like this. What kinds of books do you let your kids read? What kind of movies would you encourage them to watch? What kind of clothes would you encourage them to wear? What sort of things would you encourage or allow them to do with their hair? Or at what age would you let them wear jewellery, and what kind of jewellery would you let them wear? You recognise the kinds of issues I'm talking about. These are not really doctrinal issues in the sense that, though they are doctrinal in the sense that it's to do with Christian teaching, they're not the sort of things that appear in our Christian confessions. They're certainly not the sort of things that appear in our creeds. What they are, rather, is the ways in which different Christians try to apply what we have taken to be biblical principles to the practical realities of everyday life. So let me give you a very common example. In the last 10 or 15 years, I've encountered a number of conversations about something like Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings, or about fantasy fiction in general, in which Christians, conscientious, biblically minded, thoughtful Christians with integrity, have taken really quite markedly different views on whether it's appropriate or even godly to be reading those books or watching those films, and certainly whether it's a good idea to let our kids do so. What I'd like to do is just to help us to think through some of those things a little bit, and just to try and give some principles about how we might approach differences of opinion on matters like this, because we can be very sure there will be differences of opinion on matters like this, and if we can't handle them, we're actually going to be in quite a lot of trouble, precisely because we don't really have confessional guidelines to appeal to, not on the specifics of questions like this. And moreover, when we turn to the scriptures, what we do find are principles, but the devil's in the detail, isn't it? It's how do we work those principles out in practice? All of us are agreed that we want to fix our minds on that which is pure and honourable and godly and good, but what exactly falls into that category, and for which people are certain types of, let's say, literature or films or music and so on, for which people are those sorts of things appropriate? Actually, thinking of the list of issues, you can imagine a range of other issues which are similarly, they're an attempt to apply biblical principles in the world, like what you might eat or what kind of medicines you might prefer or want to steer clear of. All these kinds of questions, they fall under this category of trying to apply biblical principles in the world, and often Christians will disagree about them. So how are we going to approach this? Well, let me just suggest two or three things that we must do, and then a couple of things to steer clear of. The first is we've got to talk about it. There's no substitute ever for just talking with people, and actually especially people with whom we disagree about things like this. In particular, if you find yourself, thinking, let's say another family's kids, you would be surprised by something that they would or wouldn't encourage their children to read or to watch or to participate in, that is a great opportunity for us to talk to each other. It might be that you might learn something from them. It might be that they might learn something from you. We want to be like iron sharpening iron, and we mustn't be afraid of those conversations. We must be ready to listen to each other, to hear from each other, to begin a conversation like that without feeling like it's a tacit criticism of us or we're tacitly criticising them or anything like that. We really need to open the channels of communication. And my sense is that that is something we're not so bad at All Saints, but I hope it's something that we can get even better at in the future, to get to the point where we really can talk to one another openly about matters of, let's say, conscientious disagreement on issues like this. Another thing we have to be a little bit careful of is what I might call the conservative fallacy. The conservative fallacy is just my name, which I actually picked up from another friend who's a minister. It's and my name for the assumption that anybody who has a more conservative approach to a particular issue must be right. Let me give you a silly example and you'll get what I mean. Imagine if you were discussing, I don't know, the issue of what kind of books it was appropriate to let young children read. And you have one person who exercises not really any discernment about what books that they would let people read. Somebody who would allow their children to read, I don't know, a reasonable range of things, but would probably want to avoid some of the darker fiction and certainly the almost pornographic kind of fiction you find on the New York Times bestseller list. And then you've got somebody else who would exclude almost everything apart from Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. And then you've got somebody else right at the other end of this imagined spectrum who says, well, the only thing that we read in our family is the Bible. Can you see what you've got here? You've got a spectrum of imagined permissiveness at one end and conservatism at the other end. Now here's the conservative fallacy. The conservative fallacy is to imagine that whoever is furthest to this end must be right. Not because they are more small c conservative on these issues, they might just be wrong on them, but because it's possible for us mistakenly to depict them as small c conservative on those issues. In other words, we mustn't necessarily imagine that whoever flees furthest and most conspicuously and dramatically from anything that's to do with the world in the broadest sense must therefore be right. It might actually be a profoundly good thing to read some fiction. And I would argue indeed that it is a profoundly good thing to do so. That doesn't settle the question of where you draw the line on issues like fantasy fiction, Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, for example. Although I think we could fairly clearly draw some lines this side of 50 Shades of Grey and works of that ilk. But what it does do is it highlights that we mustn't simply assume that whoever's the strictest must be right. I'd caution you against that. Equally, I want to caution you against the opposite tendency. Sometimes as Reformed Christians, in various stages of our development and our thinking, we go through one or two phases, as adults now I'm thinking, where we come to enjoy and embrace and appreciate the freedom that we have in Christ. A very good example of this is when somebody who's come from a teetotaling background embraces a position, which certainly will be my position, that it's a good thing to enjoy in appropriate amounts alcoholic drinks. Now, the danger here, of course, is that in the exuberant enjoyment of our newfound freedom, we can imagine that whoever enjoys their freedom the most is therefore the most mature and has embraced the freedom we have in Christ most faithfully. And this can end with some fairly predictably disastrous consequences. You can have the sort of situation where you have, I think actually young men in particular, almost eager to outdo one another in their demonstration of the degree to which we found freedom in Christ. We don't need to be afraid of, let's say, a glass of scotch in an evening. And therefore the glass becomes 2 or 3 or 6 or 7 with some fairly ruinous consequences. So you can see we can make this mistake in a couple of different directions. On the one hand, we can assume that whoever is the strictest must be right, because we view them with a degree of admiration, perhaps. On the other hand, we can assume that whoever's the most libertarian must be right, because, look, they're embracing their freedom in Christ. Well, neither of those views is going to do us any good, is it? When we're trying to navigate biblical wisdom on these matters, and biblical wisdom is really what we want, biblical wisdom, we're not talking about biblical proof texting, biblical wisdom. What we really need to do is to be in conversation with one another, non-judgmental conversation, listening to each other, being ready to learn, being ready to engage in those conversations, perhaps in the expectation of being able to help somebody who we think might have slipped a little bit the wrong way down a certain track, but recognizing that we ourselves might be viewing this issue from the wrong perspective as well. In the end, it all comes down to that, being willing to talk and think together and to look at the impact and the consequences of various lines of action and ways of life, as well as to look together at the scriptures and try and figure out what's the best way forward. I'd encourage you to do that. Give me a shout if there are any particular issues you wanted to talk about specifically. But I actually think this is a wonderful opportunity. Issues like this present us with a wonderful opportunity, not just to grow in our faithfulness ourselves, as we're trying to work out how to engage with and navigate the world that the Lord has placed us in, but actually it's a wonderful opportunity also to get to know one another better, to love one another more, to respect and understand one another, because we're in a position to learn from one another and from one another's experiences. I hope that's helpful, and I encourage you to take that kind of advice to heart. I think it may be helpful to us all in the future. The Lord bless you, and bye for now.